Good to have your company once again. Politics is the last resort of the scoundrel, so apparently said George Bernard Shaw, a man better known for his plays and his philosophical aphorisms. But what if politics has so many scoundrels already, you just can't stand it any longer? Cue Britain 2019, where some members of Parliament are saying enough's enough, we're out of here. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. What they're not saying yet is we quit entirely. 8 opposition Labour MPs and 3 from the current party of government, the Conservatives, have left their political homes and formed what is now known as the Independent Group. Various reasons given, and we'll go into some of those, but the overall sense is that they believe the British people need and want change, can't stand the system the way it is. Well, can this bring about that change?
Brexit has divided the British public and now the political parties themselves. 8 Labour Party MPs and 3 Conservatives have quit over the strengthening of the left and right-wing voices in their respective parties and formed the Independent Group. This isn't the first time Labour MPs have protested their party's shift to the left. In 1981, 4 cabinet ministers formed the Social Democratic Party. The latest polling by YouGov suggests 14% of the British public would vote for the newly formed group. It's too early to say if this new split in British politics will be permanent or if more MPs will defect. Is the Independent Group a temporary disruption of British politics or a necessary first step to change Britain's 2-party political system?
We will now start talking about all of this. Joining me at the round table, we have the Labour councillor Mete Coban, who's also head of My Life, My Say, a charity which aims to get young people involved in politics. Alan Wage is here from the research group The UK in a Changing Europe. We welcome James Chapman once again, former UK government advisor and co-founder of J&H Communications, and Asa Bennett with us too, Brexit Commissioning Editor at the Daily Telegraph. Good to have you all here. Is there a stink coming out of Parliament that the British people can't bear, do you think, at the moment? Dave, you want to kick off?
I think there's been a real sense of disillusion that you can probably trace back to the expenses scandal, which affected all main parties, and that really shattered trust in Westminster as a place and a system. And I think there is disillusion with the whole thing. I mean, you look at Prime Minister's questions every week, which people watch from all around the world for the theatre of it, but it is theatre. It's not a proper debate. It's not a grown-up debate. It's set up to be incredibly antagonistic, to have two main. Physically, the House of Commons is configured to have 2 main parties shouting at each other. And people, I think, are sick of the sense of game playing in British politics. There was a silly example last week where the Prime Minister used a phrase at Prime Minister's questions, apparently for a bet one of her aides had put on for tea at the Ritz.
Simples.
Simples. Nobody could quite understand why she'd said it. It turned out there was a bet involving her parliamentary aide who said she could get her to say it and that would win a tea at the Ritz. So there's a sense of Westminster as a place where...
Sort of games we play on TV and in newspapers to get silly phrases in, but you wouldn't expect the head of government to be doing that.
Maybe not, but look, if you ask people whether they want politics to change, whether they like the way things are going at the moment, they're always more than likely or not to say, the majority of them to say, we want things to be better. But if you ask people now, about 80%, over 80% of people say they don't like the way the British political system's going at the moment. But people have always said that, but it's got slightly worse recently. People feel slightly less represented than ever. James is right, it probably harks back in many ways to the expenses scandal. The issue of Brexit has obviously disillusioned 2 sets of people that would want a harder form of Brexit and Remainers. So it's a sort of issue where if you're looking for a compromise, people see the system failing.
Well, it was your paper, wasn't it? It was the Telegraph that sort of led with the expenses scandal several years ago. I mean, do you detect something rotten since then, or perhaps it was before that as well?
Well, I mean, clearly it's part of the sort of drip of disillusion and distrust that's spread since then. Obviously feeding that feeling of they're all, rotters, and the why is this, their default setting, it seems to many voters, is lying. And yes, parties are very much of the status quo and of the establishment choices may win elections, but that's not a thumping vindication of their manifestos and showing that they're enthusing voters en masse. It just showed that they were the least worst option, which shows, you know...
This is what I want to come to in just a moment, and liars is a word that cannot actually be used in Parliament, but we can say it here. If people think they are liars, are these people any less of liars, those that have quit, than those who've remained?
In many ways, they're at least being honest with themselves, and I applaud their integrity and their backbone, because, of course, many MPs in the Labour ranks and the Tory ranks have sat there and moaned, chanted about the leadership, how they don't agree with it, and they've tried to almost mentally check out of the party, just telling voters in their backyards that they don't agree with the manifesto on all these pledges and points. So, yes, it's been a big leap, and obviously one can argue later about the efficacy and what's changed with that leap.
Yeah.
But at least they are putting distance and clear water between them and their former party.
So, Mete, what I'm wondering is, are these people being pragmatic because they're distancing themselves from what they regard as something putrid, if you like, or are they actually being principled?
I mean, look, I think it's a very sad state for the Labour Party. As some of them are my friends, you know, I know them very well. I think the problem is that you would question the timing of their leaving, and I think that if they felt this way for a long time, you'd question why do it right now at the point where we've got one of the biggest decisions on our hands with Brexit in the next couple of weeks. So
Do you have to tie the two together?
Well, I think so, yeah, definitely, because I think, you know, then you question whether it was always a motive, whether they've always wanted to have done this. I think it's very sad. I think, you know, when you look at Brexit, you know, some of the people like Chapman, for example, who've argued that we should remain in the EU, and, you know, if we've got problems with the EU, we should be in it to solve it rather than leaving it. I think you could say the same example for the Labour Party, and if you're not happy with the Labour Party, I think you should stay in it and actually try to change it rather than leaving it, because I don't think that's the way forward.
Yeah, just a quick one here, if I may, then let's make it a free-for-all. We should point out that some of the allegations were about anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and of course Brexit has a part to play overall. But what I'm wondering is, as I said to Mete, are these people principled or simply pragmatic by distancing themselves from the mess?
I think you could say the timing of it was actually quite pragmatic in the sense that they've changed the Labour Party's position on Brexit. The Labour Party was holding this position of not having people's vote. They've now shifted their position to saying they do back a referendum, and what changed was Chapman and 6 others leaving the Labour Party. There's no other real variable that changed there. So it was a pragmatic timing in the sense that it's actually shifted one of the positions of the two main parties. It's been had a significant effect on British politics
question
already.
that. This is the thing, and given that, really, I'd say the big change they've impacted on is how robustly Jeremy Corbyn cracks down on anti-Semitism, for example, given the suspension of one of his close comrades, Chris Williamson. That wouldn't have happened if he didn't fear that many other MPs would join the independence group, if so. On Brexit, this is where we almost loop back into the distrust point. It does seem that Jeremy Corbyn, you know, since, what was it, last year's Labour conference, he has had the second referendum on the table. You know, Labour keeps all options on the table, including a second referendum. That's the thing to get the Remainers really excited. And even now, this big supposed push, that's just him saying in a bit more of a warm tone, you see that table? It's still there. But, you know, it's not changed in a sense. And even now, you hear on the grapevine in Westminster that at the last minute he could swerve. He could say, yes, I will back a referendum, but provided we endorse a Labour Brexit first. But given the Conservative government's not going to do a Labour Brexit, it's like asking for sort of fantasy land conditions before a referendum is granted. And then that's why you're not surprised that Remainers will then get distrusted by this.
No, we're not going to make this all about Brexit. We cannot make this.
It's my job, I'm afraid.
James, you were
But I
nodding.
think, well, I would agree with that, but I also would say that and it is a Brexit point, I'm afraid, but we have got two party leaders. The two main party leaders are arguing and have been arguing, espousing positions that we know that they don't really agree with. So we know Theresa May thinks that leaving the European Union is a mess.
I am really going to stop you there, because I want to find out whether these people leaving their parliamentary groups, their homes, if you like, while remaining in Parliament, will change anything in the short term and in the long term.
I think that look, there's a huge space in the centre of British politics. So you're asking about whether this is a pragmatic move. Yes, it was, but it's also an opportunistic one, because there is a huge space in the centre of politics. There's a group of people who probably voted for the coalition, voted for David Cameron, quite like that government, actually saw in the coalition two parties coming together and being quite pragmatic and common sense working. They like that style of politics. You had two parties of different traditions coming together, and you can argue about the rights and wrongs of the coalition in its record, but at least trying to act in the national interest. And this group have similarly come together. They're people who are at the centres of their parties, but they come from different traditions. They've come together. It's not just about Brexit. I think it's going to be important for them to define, if they are going to change politics, to define their mission much more broadly and talk about things like electoral reform, not just Brexit.
But hang on, hand goes up at the back of the class. You say there's a massive gap in the middle, in the centre ground of British politics. There's a party called the Liberal Democrats that have members of Parliament, not as many as they used to, but don't they fill that ground?
Well, I think what this last 2.5 years has demonstrated is that the Liberal Democrat brand is completely shattered by coalition, fairly or unfairly. They're tainted with that. The tuition fees decision they made in government was seen as a huge betrayal of their grassroots, and the Liberal Democrats have been bumping along in the polls with a competent, if not particularly exciting leader in Vince Cable at around 6-7%. And that they're unable to break through that. We've seen already this new group is not a political party yet. It doesn't have any policies beyond wanting a second referendum on Brexit, but there are already some polls putting them in double figures, 14, 18% in one poll already, before they've even got going.
That says more about the electorate than it does about them, perhaps. In that people are happy to see others rebelling and kicking against the bricks.
I think there's a relief that people are saying what they think, because on Brexit I think there is a sense that people have not really been saying what they think. But I think it demonstrates that there is clearly a desire for a centrist, internationalist, outward-looking party in the UK. And there's this, is the new divide in British politics not left and right anymore, as it has been traditionally here for a century or so? Is it actually now an open and closed view of the world? And is that, if this new group can make that the new dividing line, then I think they could do really interesting
What was it you just said? Centrist, outward-looking party. There's space for that. That is what the Liberal Democrats used to be.
Yeah, well, I guess if we diagnose what really happened with the Liberal Democrats, their vote halved pretty much immediately as soon as they entered the coalition, so before tuition fees happened.
They sold their soul, is what people felt.
But that's going to be the same. It's going to be the same calculation that any new centrist party that gets, say, 20, 30, 40 seats in a general election will face. And it's the same structural problem that any new party will face is, and you see it not just in the UK but elsewhere, smaller parties in coalitions always suffer because they're seen as they're selling out their principles, if they had any at all, as far as people can see. So this is a problem that will face them if and when Shuka Raminder's new party becomes a party. When it gets to a general election, people will say, will you go into coalition with the Conservative Party, with the Labour Party? Same set of problems.
Okay, and we will get around, I hope, later on in this chat to why new parties often fail because of the voting system in this country. But I want to ask you what lessons this new group, all of you, can learn from looking at the reasons why the Social Democratic Party failed all those years ago.
I think it's a different time now. I'm not one to advocate for creating a new party, but I think it's a different time. We've got the role of social media, for example, which didn't exist in the 80s. I think, young people particularly who don't feel as tribal to traditional political parties. I think lots of things are changing. So if they're able to use it in the right way, things may change. But I think the big challenge remains the electoral system. And I think that's one of the reasons why we had a high turnout in the EU referendum, because of the electoral system. I think people felt like their vote was going to count. So it's let's wait and see, really. But they have to make sure. I mean, the problem for them is they're talking about let's change politics, but going off and creating a new party and repeating what the other parties would have done.
But if they talk to the young people that you through your charity are trying to get more emotionally engaged in politics, do they have any chance then of sort of getting their crampons deep into the soul of British politics?
Maybe. I think, Brexit is obviously an opportunity for them with young people, because if they're seen to be the voices of young people, particularly with, I know some of them are quite linked to the People's Vote campaign, lots of young people obviously supporting that. So if they're able to capitalise on that and be seen as this the voice for young people, I think that could potentially work in their favour. But ultimately, it will come down to their policies, as James said, and I think we have to really look at sort of whether, you know.
And we don't have any policies at the
Exactly.
moment, but we have, I would argue, pretty much the same sort of situation as outlined here a couple of years ago by the New Statesman magazine when referring back to the SDP in the early 1980s. It says here, in the early 1980s, the SDP's pitch was towards a politics of centrist moderation against the extremes of the Bennite left and Thatcherism. Well, you could say Bennite left, Corbyn, almost, in a sense, and you could say Brexit and the ERG is Thatcherism. I mean, the same set of circumstances. I'm not talking about directly, but I'm saying that the polarisation.
Sure, I don't think the parallel is exact or that helpful, because I think actually the two main parties are further out into the extremes than they were at that period. You know, Margaret Thatcher stood astride the political centre ground in the UK, whether you liked her or hated her. I mean, she created the single market that the Conservative Party today is tearing up. So I don't think the parallel is exact. I think, and the other difference...
My wife would be kicking at the TV if she saw you saying that Thatcherism represented the centre ground.
She dominated the centre ground of politics. The other difference, I think, is how atrophied political party memberships have now become, and that's very different. You know, very few people now are members of political parties. Labour Party is obviously has put on a large number of members, but they are extreme members. They're from a far left momentum group, which is dominating the Labour Party. On the Conservative side, you have a very old, very Eurosceptic, unrepresentative membership, and those memberships are important in determining the leaderships of the parties. They have real roles in how they are run and the face that they show to the world. So I think that's the parallels for me are not clear with the 1980s.
Okay, I'm not saying it's exact, but I'm saying a similar sense of polarisation exists.
I think it's not really a centrist party in the sense that if you're saying the new divide is open versus closed, this party is clearly the open side, right? And on the other side, you'd have potentially a new party formed by Nigel Farage, and you'd have this sort of open-closed thing play out as a four-party system. So this party isn't a centrist party in the sense of economically and socially the median average voter. It's representing a particular type of voter in a particular type of constituency. So actually, in that sense,
And that particular type of voter is who?
I guess it's people that are more likely to be well-educated, more likely to be under 45, sort of people that are socio-demographically more likely to have voted for Brexit and more likely to be socially liberal, and that see this new sort of Remain identity as something that they see as more important than any current party identity they have. So they associate themselves more with Remain than they do with being a member of the Labour Party.
So their job is to capture the soul of the country rather than simply put out some kind of manifesto.
Yeah, I think that's why they're going on this whole pitch on saying we're about particular social values, not about any particular policies. This is values idea that they're going on.
The irony there is, I mean, of course, like, you know, they're talking about these values, and when we look at the causes of Brexit, you see that austerity is a huge sort of cause of it, and people feeling left behind, particularly when we talk about how you've rebalanced Britain's economy. And I think the irony here is that actually by them doing this new movement and new party, is they will keep Labour out for a generation, because they will take a lot of Labour votes off them, and actually they'll be helping support the Conservative Party, which will continue to, you know, continue its austerity programme in the UK and actually further divide the country. So I think the biggest concern for someone like me is while some of them might have the intention of saying, you know, actually we should change politics, what they're actually doing is they're helping support the Conservative Party.
So I was going to say you've been quiet for a while, and I don't take that to be all
thoughtfully to the debate.
state.
Well, what can I say? It's because I was just simply going to say this, that values only get you so far for the independence group. Obviously, they currently have this very sort of vacuous fluff around them, except for Brexit, which they're very clear on, you know, pro-referendum and all that. And they hide behind this sort of motherhood and apple pie, where if you ask them for their policies, they say, well, that's the old way of doing politics, you know, asking about detail. They'll tell you what they independently think, but there is no clear line. So could you imagine what manifesto they would put up if they went before voters? Because even then...
But even they are not suggesting at this particular moment that they're ready to put out a manifesto.
Well, of course not, but they're going to have to develop it more, because of course everyone can agree we're pro-common sense, we're anti-Semitism, we're sort of pro-decency. You know, every Conservatives and Labour would agree on that they would stand for that too. They just differ on the means. Right. And they need to make clear that, because, for example, when you listen to senior Tiggers, as it were, Chris Leslie, the former...
Tiggers being the independent group bracket members.
Exactly.
Not something out of Winnie the Pooh.
Not quite. Although you could say say, some people might say that Tiggers are wonderful things. But anyway, I digress. And even Chris Leslie, he makes clear that they don't feel they can do electoral pacts with the Liberal Democrats. Liberal Democrats are still a significant force here, we must remember, because they, on paper, should be filling this role. But senior Lib Dems recognise that they are too tainted by the coalition brand, and almost if they could pull the plug, junk it, and become the new Liberal Democrats, then that would be much better for them. But the trouble is, people like Chris Leslie, who've spent their campaigning during the coalition years vigorously arguing against coalition policies, for saying they can't have anything to do with the Liberal Democrats.
But Asa, people said that about the coalition. It was impossible that the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats would work together. People, I remember having bets with colleagues about how long the coalition would last. People said it wouldn't. They couldn't. How were they going to possibly agree on a budget? And they did. So I think that this group can easily formulate some coherent policy positions, which could be potentially attractive to people. I agree with you on the Liberal Democrats, though. I think it's important for. The great problem for a new party is it has no grassroots. It has no. Who's going to go and knock on the doors and deliver the leaflets? Where are the local councillors who are the base and the bedrock of any party? So I think that actually the independent group would be much better advised to be trying to work with the Liberal Democrats, trying to fold them into one group. When then you get all the activists, you get that grassroots base.
Let me throw this idea out there. The same article I quoted from the New Statesman says there is currently no viable political leadership for a breakaway social democratic party. And I would agree with that, and I'm pretty sure that everybody here would. You say get in bed with the Liberal Democrats. There's somebody who's been pretty big on the British political scene, albeit a few years ago, who's pushing for a second referendum and been cheerleading for that. Is there any chance you think that they could get in bed with Mr. Blair?
I think that would be incredibly toxic, because Tony Blair has all the baggage that your viewers won't need to be reminded of. I completely disagree with the idea there isn't a viable leadership. Either Chuka Umunna or Anna Soubry would be a much better communicator than either of the leaders of the two main parties, obviously. And if you poll them, they got the prominence they would get from that position, then they're easily, either of them is a more attractive prospect to me as a fairly liberal centrist voter than either of the two main party leaderships currently.
Yeah, looking at the
Tony Blair dead politically as far as this is concerned?
if you look at all the sort of Kremlinology around all this, Tony Blair and his former advisors, people like Jonathan Powell, who was a key advisor for Tony Blair, are behind the scenes, and and people like Phil Collins are people that are trying to tout the idea of a new party. Their idea was to do it after Brexit. They thought that would be the best time. But there are people that were around Tony Blair that are trying to push this idea of a new party. And I think they could do with listening to some of the strategic advice from people like that, not necessarily having Tony Blair as the front and centre of any
But would he attract
political campaign.
people, or would he repel them?
I think it goes back to the same thing of if you ask people do they like politics or not, they'll say no. If you ask people do they like Tony Blair or not, they'll say, oh no, we don't like him, he's up. But he is obviously, self-evidently, a good communicator. He won 3 general elections in the UK. So I think having him as front and centre would sort of distract from the core message, the new politics message. Yeah. As an outrider in the media for the new grouping, I think that's less problematic. As someone that sort of can advise and can sort of often help tout some of their ideas and policies, sure, why not?
Mete, what do you think about the idea that he could be repellent to young voters, particularly given his track record in the Iraq War, if he were to be associated with this group?
Well, I think the problem that this group has, I know we spoke about Chuka Umunna and Anna Soubry, of course, being appealing to sort of wider voters, but if we're going off and creating a new party, you look at the rest of the MPs, I don't think they're particularly appealing to many citizens across the country. So I still think that there's a huge problem that they will have in terms of how they appeal to the country. If they go back with the same old people, back to the people, which is the reason why people feel put off in the first place, how would it be any different? And that's the question. And
so we come to this particular point, which is what must they do to succeed?
But just on that point, people writ off Jeremy Corbyn in the 2017 election, said that he wouldn't appeal to younger voters, he wouldn't appeal to normal people. He had a very small group of people that only supported him. But actually, the reason why he got a huge, done way better than what was expected was because the policies actually appealed to many people. So when you talk about young voters, when you're talking about scrapping tuition fees, when you talk about housing, all of these issues actually spoke directly to them. And I think that's the big challenge for this independent
and of course, I did allude to it early on, and we haven't got very much time left. It's gone awfully quickly, to the fact that the British voting system, which is first past the post rather than proportional representation, doesn't allow effectively for a third party to be anything other than involved in a marriage of convenience. So it's doomed anyway, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting you point to that because obviously UKIP, as an insurgent party that really put itself on the map, it rose through the ranks on the strength of the European elections, which are proportional representation. And so it really played well for them. Whereas obviously when Nigel Farage has tried to actually get a seat for himself in the first past the post system, what, 7 failures he's now
8,
had?
I think.
Yeah, 8. Yeah. So it shows the differing fortunes you have with these systems. And
So party doomed, or could it last? Very quick, yes, no?
I think it could last. I think it could be a significant force after any next general election. I think if it can get its act together.
I knew there'd be an if.
I think it will endure and be more successful than anybody imagines at the moment.
Well, that's fascinating. Listen, thanks all very much indeed. I do wish you'd had more chance to go into some of the intricacies of the British voting system, but we didn't. But we did get a few literary allusions in, didn't we?
I did my best.
With Tigger and Winnie the Pooh. We were talking beforehand about perhaps bringing in, there's a stink in the court of Denmark Hill. We could get that one in. And I did mention George Bernard Shaw at the beginning. So why don't we end with George Bernard Shaw, who not only said, politics is the last resort of the scoundrel, I think he also sent an invitation to a first night to Winston Churchill, or so it is said, saying, I'm sending you 2 tickets. Please come to my opening night and bring a friend if you have one. To which Churchill apparently replied, I can't make it to your opening night, but I will come to the second night, if you have one. Perhaps the same could be said about this political party and this programme. We will be back. We will be back with Roundtable. Thank you all very much for taking part, and thank you for watching. From me, David Foster, goodbye for now.